Hello, welcome to the Tales from the Dark Corridor. Make sure to like and subscribe. Be sure to put into the comments where you're listening from. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the stories. The thing within the timberline. In the Bob, you'll hear wind through endless pines, a distant creak, then a second sound beneath it, like something breathing through bark. This is my story, but before I begin, I need you to understand something. People disappear in the Bob Marshal Wilderness every year. Good people, experienced people. Some leave footprints that just stop. Some leave gear scattered miles apart as if something carried them. I didn't believe the stories. Not until something ancient started following me. What I'm about to tell you, I wish it wasn't real. I hiked into the Bob Marshal on a Tuesday morning, starting at the South Fork trailhead. I'd done solo trips for years, sometimes a week at a time, so I wasn't nervous. If anything, I was excited. I wanted quiet, real quiet. The kind you only get when the nearest road is 20 miles behind you. But the forest felt wrong from the start. No birds, no squirrels, no buzzing insects. Silence other than the crunch of my boots and my own breathing. Around day 2, I reached a meadow with the ruins of a collapsed cabin logs caved in on themselves. A relic from a century ago, maybe. It wasn't on my map, but that didn't bother me. The Bob eats history. I set up camp on the far side of the meadow, watched the sun set, wrote in my journal, and let the quiet settle. But sometime around dusk, I felt eyes on me. You know that instinct? That primal tightening in the chest? I turned toward the tree line. Nothing. But the shadows felt denser, like they were refusing the firelight. I told myself I was imagining it, but I knew deep down I wasn't. Around midnight, something snapped a branch loud enough to jolt me awake. I sat up, listening. The entire forest was carved out in silence. No wind, no sounds of water, nothing. Then out of nowhere, I heard footsteps, heavy, dense ones, slow ones, walking a deliberate circle around my camp. I grabbed my flashlight. It flickered, dimmed, then died completely. Whatever was out there, it didn't run, or charge, or sniff the food bag. It paced slowly, like it was thinking, contemplating. After what felt like an hour, the steps faded, not in the direction they came from, but around the back of my tent. I didn't sleep again. I just waited for morning. The next day, I should have left, but curiosity, or stupidity, pushed me deeper into the Bob. Around noon, I stopped at a small creek. The water was clear, cold. I knelt to drink, and that's when I saw an antler in the mud. But not like any animal I've seen. It twisted in spirals, like wood had grown through bone. As I picked it up, something whispered behind me. Not a human whisper, a dry rasp, like wind pushing through a dead tree's hollow center. I turned, and I saw it. A figure stepped between the trees. It was 8, maybe 9 feet tall, its limbs long and uneven, bending like soaked branches. Its body flickered like a mirage, like it wasn't fully solid. Antlers massive, spiraling like twisted roots, rose from its head and its face. God, I'm trembling as I recall this. Its face was a sheet of smooth bark. No eyes, no mouth. Just the faint suggestion of features worn away over thousands of years. I froze, every part of me locked. Then it leaned, not stepped, leaned toward me, its entire upper body tilting silently, like a tree bowing in wind that didn't exist. I stumbled backward, fell into the water, and when I looked up, it was gone. But the forest wasn't silent anymore. The silence had intention and awareness, as if every tree was watching. I sprinted back to camp, and when I arrived, my stomach dropped. My tent was shredded open, but not clawed, nor slashed wildly. It was cut clean, with deep arcs like something had dragged curved bones across the fabric. And in the dirt, had indentations, deep ones, as if fingers the size of branches pressed into the soil around where I slept. I packed what little wasn't destroyed and ran down the trail. I didn't care where, just away. Right after sundown, the forest began knocking. Soft, rhythmic. Wood on wood. Knock, knock, knock. Behind me, then ahead of me, then to my left. It wasn't echo, it was movement. It was circling me again. By full dark, I'd lost the trail. The air felt thick, like the forest had shifted closer. Something massive crawled through the canopy above me, keeping pace with my steps, matching them, studying. When I found the river, I collapsed at the edge, hands shaking too badly to strike a spark. And then I heard it behind me, breathing, dry, splintered breathing, like lungs full of kindling. Slowly I turned. The entity stood 10 feet away. Its antlers scraped branches overhead. It leaned forward towards me. It crouched until its faceless head hovered inches from mine. I couldn't run. I couldn't scream. I was paralyzed with fear. And something, not a voice, but a pressure pressed into my mind, like an invitation. No, a command. My paralysis broke, and I screamed and flung myself backward into the freezing river. The current grabbed me like cold hands and tore me away from that thing. I drifted for miles, half-conscious, until the river spat me onto a gravel bar at dawn. Two backpackers found me mud-covered, shaking uncontrollably. They radioed for extraction. When the ranger arrived, I told her everything. I expected her to laugh, judge me, or chalk it up to hypothermia. But she didn't. She just listened, remaining quiet and serious. When I finished, she said, "People disappear out here every year. We find their packs, sometimes their bones. Never tracks, never signs of a fight or struggle. You're lucky you ran for the river. The old things don't cross water." I stared at her, stunned. She nodded once as if confirming something she'd always known. There are old things in the Bob Marshal, older than the tribes, older than the trees, and they don't like to be seen. I don't camp anymore. I barely sleep. When I do, I dream of antlers scraping the sky and a face with no features leaning down to examine me. And sometimes, just before dawn, I swear I hear it. The soft tapping of wood on wood, calling me back to the timberline, calling me back to my doom. And I'm afraid one day I'll answer the call. The Thing Within the Timberline, Part 2, What Follows the Marked. The Bob Marshal Wilderness, Montana. People think trauma fades. They think nightmares weaken with time, that the mind adjusts. They don't understand. Trauma follows. For me, it's the ancient, immortal being that stalked me in the Bob Marshal Wilderness. Because it didn't stay in those woods, it followed me home. Not in flesh, not in footsteps, but somehow in awareness and in whispers. It started 3 months after the rescue. I'd finally forced myself to sleep through the night again, meds and all. But one morning just before sunrise, I woke to a sound. Knock, knock, knock. Not on the door, not on the walls. From beneath the house. 3 slow, deliberate strikes, the exact rhythm it used in the forest. My heart seized. For a full minute, I couldn't move. When I finally crawled out of bed and checked, I saw nothing. Dry foundation, silent backyard. I told myself it was pipes, thermal expansion, maybe a dream. But I knew better. I knew the truth. A week later, I found something on my porch, a small, twisted piece of antler, curved in the same pattern as the one I saw in the creek bed. I hadn't brought anything back with me. I was sure of it, and no animal in Montana grows antlers like that. I threw it in the garbage bin outside and drove to work, white-knuckling the steering wheel the whole way. I was despondent the whole day. I stayed in my office, barely completing any assigned tasks. When I came home that night, it was on the porch again, clean and dry, laid perfectly perpendicular to the welcome mat, placed as if delivered. But the worst moment came 2 nights after that. I was brushing my teeth, trying not to look at the mirror. Mirrors had been hard since the river. When the bathroom light flickered, for a split second I saw something behind me. The shape too tall for the room, shoulders like deadwood, antlers scraping the ceiling, but with no sound, no smell, no shift in the air. Just a presence reflected where nothing physically stood. The light stabilized, the reflection was gone. I shut the bathroom door and slept in my truck that night with the engine running. 2 days later, I drove back to the ranger station. The woman who'd extracted me. She wasn't surprised to see me. That was the first bad sign. When I told her what had been happening, the knocking, the antler, the reflection, her expression didn't change. She just asked, "Did you touch it?" I nodded. She sighed. Not annoyed, not disbelieving, but resigned. She explained something I wish she hadn't. She said some places in the Bob weren't wilderness in the way we meant it. They were territories, ancient ones, boundaries that humans weren't meant to cross. And the entity, the one with antlers like twisted roots, it didn't hunt for food or for territory. It hunted for awareness. You saw it, she said quietly. That's enough. Once you see one of the old ones, they remember you. My hands shook so badly I almost dropped my coffee. I asked her what I should do. She didn't have an answer. Don't go back, she said, and don't acknowledge it when it appears. Has that worked for anyone? I whispered. Her silence told me everything. Later that night, I heard whispering, not outside, not under the house, inside the walls themselves. Dry, splintering syllables, like a language spoken by trees cracking in winter frost for the last million years. I pressed my ear to the drywall, and for the first time, I heard it clearly. It was my name, not spoken aloud, not in sound, but inside my skull the same way it whispered in the woods. I stumbled backward, hands over my ears, but the whisper didn't stop. It grew louder, sharper, insistent, calling me. I grabbed my keys, ran to the truck, and drove, as far as the fuel tank would take me. I pulled onto a turnout along Highway 2 around 2 a.m. that morning. There were dense pines on both sides and faint sounds of a river nearby. I turned off the engine and tried to breathe. I'd barely closed my eyes when the smell hit me. Wet bark, cold earth, rotting wood. My entire right side went numb. Slowly, I turned toward the passenger window. Nothing was there, but the pine trees directly across the road, they were too still, as if the wind refused to touch them. Then one of the trunks bent, not like a sway, not like wind, but like something enormous leaned out from behind it. A silhouette taller than the branches, antlers etched against the stars, faceless head angled toward me, watching, not approaching, just waiting. It wasn't bound to the Bob Marshal anymore. It had come to claim what it had marked me. I drove again in a blind panic. Hours passed, and when I finally reached a motel, I went into the bathroom to splash water on my face, and that's when I saw it, a mark, just below my collarbone. It wasn't a bruise or a scratch, but a pattern, a thin, branching lattice under the skin, like antlers growing inward instead of outward, and it was spreading, darkening, much like roots. I stared at it, my pulse hammering, and I realized something. The ranger was wrong. The entity didn't follow me because I saw it. It followed me because it chose me. I wasn't prey. I was claimed, marked for death. I sat on the edge of the motel bed until the sun began to rise. Every instinct told me to keep moving, but another part of me, a quieter part, felt drawn. Not coerced, not threatened. Invited. A soft knock sounded at the door. 3 slow taps. I didn't answer. Didn't even breathe. A moment later, the knock came from the window, then the bathroom door, then the ceiling, the from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. I covered my ears, but the knocking wasn't sound. It was inside me. It was calling me, summoning me, reminding me of the river, the darkness, the towering figure bending down to inspect me like an ancient collector of lost souls. By 7 a.m., the knocking stopped, but not because it had left, because it no longer needed to knock. The mark on my chest had spread across my shoulder and partway down my arm. Black branches etching themselves into my skin, like it was preparing me. But for what, I didn't know. I don't sleep anymore. I don't go outside for long, but none of it matters. The entity knows where I am even at this motel, even far from the Bob Marshal Wilderness. Sometimes when the room is quiet, I feel its presence behind me, even before I turn and see nothing there. The ranger said the old things don't cross water. She was wrong. Or maybe some things are old enough that rules don't apply anymore. I don't know how much time I have before the mark finishes, whatever it's doing. But tonight I hear whispering again. Closer. Clearer. And I know the truth now. The monster in the Bob didn't lose me in the river. It found me, marked me, and claimed me. And it's coming back to finish what it started. The Thing Within the Timberline. Part 3. By the time I left the motel, The black branching pattern had crept across half my chest and up the side of my neck. It didn't hurt. It pulled, like something beneath the skin was growing towards something else. I drove for hours on anywhere but west, anywhere away from Montana. But no matter which way the highway curved, the same sensation sat heavy on my sternum. Something was waiting for me, something patient. As dust settled, my reflection in the rearview mirror flickered. For a moment I saw antlers behind me, twisted, organic, growing. I slammed the brakes, my heart hammering, and the road ahead blurred into shadows. My skin felt tight and my vision swam. The mark was doing something to me, changing me. I got back on the road, not knowing where else to go. But the truth was forming in my mind. Running wasn't keeping it away. Running was somehow leading me toward it. At around midnight, I pulled into a gas station outside Browning. The attendant froze when he saw me, not in fear, but in recognition. He stared at the mark creeping up my neck like he'd seen it before. After a few seconds, he said quietly, "They always come back." I asked him what he meant. He just shook his head. While I was on my way out, he leaned close and whispered, "If it calls you, don't fight it in the dark." Something in his tone told me this was not his first encounter with someone like me. I got back in the truck. My hands shook on the steering wheel. My chest burned. The mark pulsed like a heartbeat. Tears ran down my cheeks, and before I knew it, I was driving west, toward the Bob Marshal Wilderness, not by choice, by compulsion, by tether. The entity wasn't tracking me anymore. It was calling me home. I reached the trailhead around 3 a.m. I saw no moon. I felt no wind, only darkness, oppressive darkness. The moment I stepped out of the truck, the forest exhaled. Not metaphorically. I heard it. It was a long, low breath, stirring only the path ahead, as if the trees had been holding themselves stiff, waiting for me. The mark on my chest glowed faintly under the truck lights, a dull, pulsing amber like resin bleeding through bark. I stepped into the tree line. My flashlight dimmed instantly. By the second switchback, it died completely. And then, the knocking began. Knock, knock, knock. Soft, measured. Nearer each time. My breath iced. The forest was alive around me, leaning inward, closing the distance. I should have run, but the mark kept pulling me deeper. I didn't know then that there was still one way out, a terrible way. By the time I reached the old meadow, I smelled it. Wet bark, cold rot, ancient soil disturbed for the first time in decades. The collapsed cabin sat half sunk into the earth, but now the surrounding trees angled toward it unnaturally, as if bowing. And standing at the far end of the meadow, it waited, no flicker, no silhouette. It was fully present. Antlers spiraling outward like twisted constellations, limbs long and wooden, jointed like snapped branches, roots curled where feet should be, and its faceless head tilted slowly as if studying something fragile. The mark on my chest burned hot. My pulse synced with the entity's presence, like two hearts learning each other. It stepped forward, smooth, silent, fluid, as if gliding through dimensions instead of walking. A voice pressed into my skull. Return. Not spoken, but remembered. Return. The mark spread over my ribs. My vision dimmed at the edges. I felt roots beneath my skin anchoring me in place. I was becoming part of it, part of the forest, part of the old world. But then something inside me snapped. Not fear, not resistance, survival. The ranger's words hit me like lightning. Old things don't cross water. I stumbled backward, breaking the entity's gaze, and ran. Branches clawed my arms, the forest pushing against me, steering me away from the river. But adrenaline surged. The mark on my chest seared, trying to force me to stop, to turn, to surrender. I didn't. I sprinted. The knocking escalated around me. Not one source, but dozens. Knock, 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 knock. Like every tree was calling out. The entity behind me moved without sound, closing the distance with terrifying grace. I saw the river through the trees, a faint silver line. My legs weakened, my lungs burned. The mark screamed inside my mind. But I reached the bank. Behind me, the entity loomed at the tree line. Its antlers scraped the upper branches, sending a shower of needles to the ground. Its faceless head tilted, not angry, almost mournful, as if losing something it believed was already its own. It stepped forward. The roots forming its feet touched the riverbank and stopped. The forest held its breath. I plunged into the river like before. Cold slammed into me, but the moment the water touched my skin, the mark burned away. It felt like sap meeting fire, splitting and curling and fading. Behind me, the entity reached out with one long arm but could not cross. The water glowed faintly where its shadow touched it, steam swirling upward. And then it withdrew, slowly, silently, back into the forest, back into its realm. Watching, always watching, but unable to follow. For now, I washed ashore miles downstream. Again, I was shaking and half-conscious. Search and rescue found me the next morning. Doctors again said it was hypothermia, stress hallucinations, delirium. But the ranger who visited me in the hospital knew better. She looked at my bare chest where the branching mark had been. Her face tightened. "You escaped," she said quietly. "But understand this." She leaned in. "It only lets go once." I asked her what that meant. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. She just shook her head and left. Because some nights when everything is quiet, I swear I hear it again. Knock, knock, knock. Calling me. Patient, ancient, and waiting for the moment I step into the forest again. I fell the pull again. The thing within the timberline, Prequel. The elder of the hollow pines. Long before the Bob Marshal had a name, before the first tribes settled the land, before glaciers retreated and filled the valleys with rivers, before the larch and pine grew tall enough to whisper, something else lived here. It was not an animal, not a spirit, not a god. It was a shape of the forest, a consciousness grown from root and stone, a watcher formed when the world was colder and the nights lasted longer. It had no name, because nothing alive then had a voice to name it. It existed where the light rarely reached, where the old-growth trees grew so tightly that even predators avoided the shadows between them. It did not feed. It did not sleep. It simply was, as endless as the seasons. And for a long time, it was alone. The first people and the first rule broken. Thousands of years passed. The forest changed. Animals returned. Humans came with them. Most kept to the open plains or river valleys, but a few ventured deep into the dense interior, drawn by a kind of unsettling curiosity. The same pull felt by the man in part one. They felt a presence, all of them, a heaviness beneath the ground, a watchfulness in the air that grew stronger the deeper they traveled. The first people learned quickly. The interior was not to be entered alone. What lived there did not chase them, did not harm them. It simply watched. But when a lone hunter, curious, bold, foolish, ventured past the ancient larch grove during the longest night of winter, something changed. He glimpsed it, a silhouette among the trees, antlers twisted like roots, a faceless head of bark and shadow, limbs too long and still. The hunter did not scream. He simply froze. The entity leaned, studied, and examined him, but not with hunger, with recognition. The hunter returned to his people days later, shaking, sleepless, changed. He heard whispers where none existed. He knew what stalked him even when he stared into firelight. He fled across the plains, but the forest shadow followed him. And when he died alone, far from home, his body showed no wounds. Only black branching patterns beneath the skin, like roots spreading outward from the heart. After that, the people left the deep interior alone. The thing of the timberline did not cross rivers or open land. It stayed within its ancient boundary. For a while, the first settlers. Ignorance breeds curiosity. Centuries passed. Then came settlers-travelers who believed the wilderness could be charted, owned, tamed. Some built small cabins along the edges of the forest. Most avoided the deeper paths after dark. But a few loggers, trappers, explorers went too far in. They told stories, quietly after whiskey, Stories about trees that moved when you weren't looking, knocking that echoed without wind, antlers found twisted into impossible spirals, and silhouettes taller than any man, watching from the ridge. One story survived longer than the rest. A trapper named Elias. He vanished for 3 days. When he returned, he said he'd gotten lost in the interior and stumbled into a grove where the air felt thick and the trees leaned inward as if listening. He swore he'd seen a figure among them, human-shaped, but wrong, like wood had learned to walk. No one believed him until he died that winter, black branching veins spreading across his chest. His cabin collapsed decades later. Those rotted logs, they still sit in that meadow where the man in part one pitched his tent. That was Elias's cabin and his grave. What the entity is, and why it marks the ones who see. The forest entity has existed since before language. It is not evil, not in the human sense. It is curiosity given shape, a guardian of its own territory, a collector of its own stories. And seeing it, truly seeing it, is a violation it cannot ignore. The moment a human locks eyes with its faceless form, something forms between them. A recognition, a tether, a mark. The entity does not chase prey. Prey is beneath it. Instead, it studies the ones who cross its boundary, who witness its presence. It watches them leave, waits, learns them. And when the time is right, it comes to them not for revenge, not for blood, but to complete the connection they started. Those it chooses begin to change. The mark appears, the forest whispers, and eventually they return. Not because it drags them back, because the mark compels it. Why it awakened now? The modern trigger. For decades, the interior stayed undisturbed. Few humans ventured deep enough to breach its territory. But recently, with maps improving, with hikers pushing further, with solitude becoming a commodity, more people entered the old larch groves. More people glimpsed it, and every person who sees the entity adds something to it. Knowledge, awareness, boundaries are stretched wider. The man in part one was not the first in modern times, but he was the first to run, to survive, to take the memory of the entity far beyond the forest. And because he remembered it, because he feared it, because he carried its image in his mind like a wound, the entity's awareness followed that thread. All the way to his home, the mark was always going to appear. From the moment he stumbled into the creek bed and lifted that twisted antler, his fate was sealed. He didn't awaken the entity. He alerted it. The entity today, older than maps, still watching, and the truth behind the timberline. It still resides in the Bob Marshal interior, but its reach is longer now. Memory strengthens it. Fear calls it. Awareness feeds it. And those who look upon it have already been chosen. Some come back to the wilderness willingly. Others vanish without returning. But all who see the entity carry a part of the forest with them. A whisper, a mark, a claim. The entity is as old as the land itself. Older than the trees that hide it. Older than the rivers that bound it. Older than the fear that accompanies its presence. And if you ever wander too deep into the Bob Marshal, past the last switchback, past the forgotten cairns, and past the collapsed cabin in the meadow, you may feel it watching. And if you see it, truly see it, the forest will never forget your face, even if it has none of its own.